Good evening, dear listener. If you enjoy calm history like this, you can also listen on Spotify or explore history audiobooks on Audible. Both are linked in the description for you. Tonight, we step into shoes worn thin by desperate necessity, into a world where every sunrise brings fresh terror and every sunset counts as victory. You are no longer yourself. You are Marguerite, a 32-year-old mother in the year 1348, and your three children depend entirely on your wits, your strength, and your unbreakable will to survive. The rooster hasn't even crowed when you feel the familiar weight of dread settling across your chest like a stone. Your eyes open to complete darkness, but your body already knows the rhythm. Agnes, your youngest, at barely 3 years old, is whimpering beside you on the straw mattress that serves as your family's bed. Her small body burns with fever, and you know without looking that the rash has spread further across her neck. Your hand moves instinctively to her forehead, and the heat radiating from her skin sends ice through your veins. This is how it starts. This is how the Black Death announces its arrival in your home, just as it has in countless others throughout your village. But you are not countless others. You are a mother, and surrender is not written in your vocabulary. Thomas, your middle child at 7 years old, stirs beside his sister. His breathing is labored, and you can hear the wet rattle in his chest that appeared 2 days ago. Your eldest, Marie, at 10, sleeps fitfully near the wall, her face pale but mercifully cool to the touch. 3 children, 3 souls depending on you to work miracles with nothing but determination and whatever scraps of knowledge you can piece together from whispered conversations with other desperate mothers. You rise before dawn because dawn waits for no one, and neither does death. The dirt floor is cold beneath your bare feet, and the single room that houses your entire family feels smaller each day, as if the walls themselves are closing in with the weight of your fears. Your husband disappeared 3 weeks ago, swept away by the same sickness that now threatens your babies. There was no time for proper mourning, no luxury of grief. Survival demands every moment of your attention. The fire died during the night, as it always does, and you must rebuild it with hands that shake from exhaustion and terror. The kindling is damp from yesterday's rain that leaked through the thatched roof, but you work patiently, methodically, because patience is the only tool you have left. 1 spark, 2 sparks. Finally, blessed warmth begins to spread through the room. Water is your first priority, always. The well at the center of the village has been poisoned, they say, contaminated by the same evil that carries sickness from house to house. But the stream beyond the mill still runs clear, and you must reach it before the other mothers claim what little clean water remains. You wrap your shawl tighter around your shoulders and slip into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving your children sleeping under every blanket you own. The village streets tell stories of horror that daylight mercifully conceals. Bodies lie where they fell, covered hastily with whatever cloth their families could spare. The baker's shop stands empty, its owner carried away by fever just yesterday. The blacksmith's forge has been cold for a week. Yet you walk these streets because you must, because your children need you to transform terror into action, despair into determination. At the stream, you encounter Margaret from the house near the church. Her eyes are hollow with the same exhaustion that weighs down your own soul. She has lost 2 children already, and her remaining daughter grows weaker each day. You exchange no words, but you share the universal language of mothers in crisis. You help each other fill your vessels with precious water, and you both pretend not to notice the tears that fall silently into the stream. Returning home, you find Agnes awake and calling for you in a voice so small it breaks your heart into pieces you cannot afford to feel.
Her fever has climbed higher, and the rash now covers her arms like angry red flowers blooming under her skin. You wet a cloth with the precious clean water and place it gently on her forehead, whispering prayers to saints whose names you barely remember from childhood. Thomas sits up slowly, his young face etched with confusion and fear. He understands enough to know that something terrible is happening, but not enough to comprehend the magnitude of the threat surrounding your family. You force your voice to remain calm, steady, reassuring, even as panic claws at your throat like a living thing. Food has become an impossible puzzle with pieces that never quite fit together.
The grain stores were exhausted weeks ago, and the remaining merchants demand prices that mock your empty purse. But children must eat, especially sick children whose bodies fight battles that would fail grown men. You remember your mother's teachings about plants that grow wild in the forest, herbs that might ease suffering or provide nourishment when nothing else remains. Marie wakes as you prepare to venture into the woods beyond the village. At 10 years old, she has become your partner in this desperate dance of survival. Her childhood ended the day her father fell ill, and now she carries responsibilities that should belong to adults. You see your own determination reflected in her young eyes, and you know she will guard her siblings with the same fierce protectiveness that burns in your chest. The forest feels different now, charged with dangers, both real and imagined. Wild animals grow bolder as fewer humans venture into their domain, and desperate people sometimes do desperate things when they encounter mothers carrying precious supplies. But you know these woods from girlhood adventures, and you remember where the healing plants grow thick and strong. Willow bark for fever, elderberries for strength, wild garlic to ward off infection. These remedies might be nothing more than superstition, but they represent hope, and hope is the only medicine you can afford. You gather what you can find, stuffing your apron full of leaves and roots and berries that might mean the difference between life and death for your babies. The sun climbs higher as you work, and you know other mothers throughout the village are engaged in their own desperate searches for salvation. Some tend sick children in houses that smell of death and despair. Others have already lost their battles and now face the impossible task of continuing to live in a world that has taken everything precious from them. You are all warriors in the same war, fighting with weapons made of love and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to surrender. Returning home, you find Thomas trying to comfort his little sister, his small hands smoothing her hair with a gentleness that makes your heart ache. Children should not have to face such horrors, should not have to watch their siblings suffer, should not have to understand that the adults who are supposed to protect them are just as frightened and helpless as they are. You brew tea from the willow bark, sweetening it with the last precious drops of honey hidden in your stores. Agnes drinks reluctantly, her small face screwing up at the bitter taste, but she trusts you completely, absolutely, with the blind faith that children give their mothers. That trust feels heavier than stone across your shoulders, because you know how fragile your power really is, how little you can actually do against forces so much larger than yourself. The afternoon brings visitors that you both dread and desperately need. Other mothers from the village, women who have become your closest allies in this fight for survival. You share information in hushed tones, comparing symptoms, exchanging remedies, offering what comfort you can to those whose children have grown worse since yesterday. Sarah from the house near the mill has tried everything she can think of for her son's fever, but nothing seems to help. Elizabeth, whose husband was a merchant before the sickness came, still has some coin hidden away, but there are no healers left to pay, no medicines left to buy. You are all educated now in ways no mother should ever have to learn, experts in symptoms and treatments that textbooks have never been written about. Marie helps you tend to Agnes, while the other mothers share their stories of small victories and devastating defeats. She changes her sister's cloth with hands that should be playing with dolls, and she whispers lullabies in a voice that trembles with the weight of responsibilities no child should carry. But she does carry them,
because love makes warriors of us all, regardless of age. Evening approaches with the weight of another day survived, but survival feels different when measured in hours instead of years. Agnes seems slightly cooler, or perhaps that is merely wishful thinking disguised as medical observation. Thomas has eaten a small portion of the thin gruel you managed to prepare from your dwindling supplies. Marie remains strong, your anchor in storms that threaten to sweep away everything you hold precious. You check and double-check your children throughout the night, measuring their breathing, monitoring their temperatures, adjusting blankets and cloths, and positioning with the precision of someone who understands that details can mean everything. Sleep comes in fragments between these vigilant watches, and your dreams are filled with visions of healthy children running through fields that exist only in memory.
This is your reality now. This endless cycle of fear and hope and desperate action repeated day after day without promise of resolution. You are no longer the woman you were before sickness came to steal your world away. You have been transformed into something harder, more focused, stripped down to the essential core of what it means to be a mother when everything else has been taken away. Tomorrow will bring fresh challenges, new fears, different battles in the same war you fight every single day. But tonight, your children still breathe. Tonight, they still call your name when darkness frightens them. Tonight, you have not yet failed in the most important task ever given to any human being. You are Marguerite, and you are not finished fighting. The first gray light of dawn creeps through the gaps in your thatched roof, and with it comes the sound that has haunted your sleep for weeks. Agnes is coughing again, that wet, desperate sound that turns your blood to ice water. You know this cough. You have heard it echoing through the village streets, drifting from houses where mothers just like you wage the same impossible battle against an enemy they cannot see or understand. Your feet hit the cold dirt floor before your mind has fully awakened, muscle memory guiding you through movements that have become as natural as breathing. Check Agnes first. Her forehead burns like a coal pulled fresh from the fire, but she is breathing. She is still breathing. That counts as victory in this new world where victories are measured in heartbeats and exhaled breaths. Thomas stirs as you move past him, his 7-year-old body curled protectively around a wooden toy horse that his father carved before the sickness took him away. The toy is one of the few remaining connections to the life you lived before, when your biggest worry was whether the harvest would be sufficient and if Thomas would outgrow his shoes before winter arrived. Now you would trade every memory of that peaceful existence for one day when your children's eyes shine with health instead of fever. Marie sits up without prompting, her 10-year-old face already alert and ready for whatever horrors this new day might bring. She has learned to read your expressions with the skill of someone whose survival depends on understanding unspoken truths. When she sees you checking Agnes with hands that linger just a moment too long on her forehead, Marie's jaw sets with determination that mirrors your own. The water bucket sits empty beside the door, a wooden reminder that your first task begins before the sun fully rises. The stream beyond the village demands a journey through streets littered with evidence of battles lost by other mothers who fought the same war you continue fighting. But clean water means everything when fever burns through small bodies like wildfire, consuming dry wood. You wrap your heaviest shawl around shoulders that have grown sharp with hunger and stress. Food has become a luxury reserved for your children, and you survive on scraps and determination and the absolute refusal to consider any alternative to victory. Your stomach protests its emptiness, but you ignore its complaints, the same way you ignore the exhaustion that weighs down your bones like chains. The door creaks as you slip into the morning darkness, leaving behind the sound of your children's labored breathing and carrying with you the weight of their absolute dependence. Every step away from them feels like betrayal, but every step toward the stream represents hope made manifest through action. This is the paradox of motherhood in times of crisis.
You must leave them to save them. The village reveals its wounds more clearly in the growing light. The cooper's workshop stands silent, its owner buried 3 days ago beside his wife and infant son. The tavern where merchants once gathered to trade stories and coin now serves as an impromptu hospital where the few remaining healthy adults tend to neighbors who have no family left to care for them. Marguerite appears at your shoulder like a ghost materializing from the morning mist. Her presence both comforts and terrifies you because she represents the future you might face if your own battles end in defeat. She has buried 3 children in the past month, but she continues moving through each day with mechanical precision, helping other mothers fight wars she has already lost. Together you walk the muddy path toward the stream, 2 women bound by shared understanding of impossible choices and devastating losses. Neither speaks because words have become inadequate for expressing the depth of fear and love and desperate hope that drives you both forward despite overwhelming odds. The stream runs clear and cold, untouched by the corruption that has poisoned wells throughout the region. You fill your bucket with water that might as well be liquid salvation, precious beyond gold or jewels or any treasure that existed in your previous life. Marguerite helps you lift the heavy vessel, and you return the favor. 2 mothers sharing burdens too great for any individual to bear alone. Walking back through streets that grow more desolate each day, you encounter Father Benedict emerging from the church where he has spent the night administering last rites to parishioners whose families could no longer care for them. His face carries the weight of countless confessions from parents begging forgiveness for children they could not save, and his eyes hold shadows that speak of faith tested beyond human endurance. He nods silently as you pass, offering a blessing with hands that shake from exhaustion and grief.
You accept his gesture gratefully, because hope arrives in many forms, and you have learned to recognize every possible source of strength. Religion, superstition, folk wisdom passed down through generations of mothers who face their own impossible challenges. You embrace them all, because desperation makes believers of everyone. Agnes calls for you before you reach the door, her small voice carrying across the morning air like a prayer answered. She is awake, aware, asking for water in words that sound almost normal. Your heart leaps with cautious optimism, because normal feels miraculous after days of delirium and fever-twisted rambling. Thomas has managed to sit up without assistance, his young face pale but alert. He watches you with eyes that hold too much understanding for someone his age, but understanding paired with trust so complete it takes your breath away. He believes you will save him, because that is what mothers do. They work miracles through love and stubbornness and a refusal to accept defeat. You prepare willow bark tea with the careful precision of someone performing a sacred ritual. Every measurement matters when dealing with remedies that walk the narrow line between healing and harm. Too little might prove useless against fevers that climb higher each hour. Too much could bring dangers of its own to small bodies already pushed beyond their limits. The bitter liquid meets resistance from Agnes, but you persist with gentle patience that masks urgent desperation. She must drink. She must accept this offering of hope disguised as medicine. Her small hands push weakly against the wooden cup, but eventually she swallows enough to satisfy your maternal calculation of what constitutes adequate treatment. Maria assists without being asked, holding her sister's head steady and whispering encouragement in a voice that trembles with unshared tears. She has become your partner in this fight, shouldering responsibilities that should never fall to children, but which circumstances have forced upon her young shoulders. Her childhood ended the day sickness entered your home, replaced by a premature wisdom and courage that both inspires and breaks your heart. The morning progresses with the careful routine you have established to impose order on chaos that threatens to overwhelm every aspect of your existence. Check temperatures, administer remedies, encourage small amounts of food, monitor breathing, adjust blankets, whisper reassurances that sound convincing even when you barely believe them yourself.
Other mothers begin arriving as the sun climbs higher, drawn by the same desperate need for community that has bonded women throughout history. When faced with threats too large for individual resistance, they bring news from their own households, sharing information about symptoms and treatments with the clinical precision of battlefield surgeons comparing wounds and strategies. Elizabeth reports that her youngest daughter's fever broke during the night, offering hope that burns bright in hearts accustomed to disappointment. Sarah describes a new rash appearing on her son's chest, seeking advice from women who have become unwilling experts in cataloging the progression of symptoms that might herald recovery or signal approaching defeat. You listen carefully to every detail, storing information that might prove crucial when your own children's conditions change or worsen. These women have become your teachers, your students, your fellow warriors in battles that demand everything while promising nothing in return except the possibility of tomorrow. The afternoon brings tasks that must be completed regardless of how desperate your circumstances become. Clothes need washing, though soap has become scarce and clean water precious beyond measure. Food must be prepared from ingredients that grow fewer each day. Fuel for the fire requires gathering, though venturing beyond the village boundaries grows more dangerous as desperate people make desperate choices. Maria accompanies you on these necessary expeditions, her presence both comfort and additional responsibility. You must protect her while relying on her help, keep her safe while teaching her skills she will need if your own strength fails. The balance requires constant adjustment, like walking across ice that might crack beneath the weight of miscalculation. Agnes sleeps fitfully through the afternoon, her small body fighting battles you cannot see, but whose progress you measure through subtle changes in breathing and skin temperature. Each peaceful moment feels like a gift, each sign of distress like punishment for daring to hope that this particular child might be strong enough to survive when so many others have not. Thomas rallies enough to ask for food, his appetite returning like sunrise after the longest night. You prepare thin gruel from your dwindling stores, stretching ingredients that should feed one person across 3 hungry children whose growing bodies demand nourishment you cannot always provide. But he eats willingly, gratefully, and his improved appetite signals healing that might be taking root beneath symptoms that still cause concern. Evening approaches with the weight of another day, measured in small victories and manageable defeats. Your children remain with you. They still respond when you call their names. They still reach for your hand when fear makes the darkness seem full of threats that daylight keeps at bay. These simple facts constitute success in circumstances where success has been redefined by necessity and desperation. You prepare for another night of vigilant watching, knowing that fever often climbs highest in the dark hours when human resistance runs lowest. Your own exhaustion pulls at consciousness like tide dragging sand from beneath your feet. But mothers do not rest when their children's lives hang in balance, measured by heartbeats and shallow breaths. The fire crackles with reassuring warmth, fed by wood gathered through afternoon expeditions that tested your courage against growing dangers. Light dances across walls that have witnessed too much suffering and not enough joy, creating shadows that seem to hold memories of better times when laughter echoed through rooms now filled with worried whispers and muffled coughs. This is your existence now, this careful balance between hope and despair that defines every moment of every day. You have been transformed by necessity into something stronger and more focused than the woman who once worried about trivial concerns that seem laughable now. Love has made you fierce beyond your own recognition, capable of enduring hardships that would have seemed impossible before your children's lives depended on your refusal to surrender. Tomorrow will test your resolve again, with fresh challenges and new fears wrapped in familiar clothing. But tonight you have prevailed. Tonight your babies sleep under your protection. Tonight you remain undefeated in the most important battle any human being can fight. The sound that wakes you is not your children's coughing this time, but something far worse. Silence. Complete, terrible silence where Agnes's labored breathing should be filling the pre-dawn darkness with proof of her continued existence. Your heart stops before your mind catches up, terror flooding through your veins like ice water as you reach desperately for her small form in the blackness. Your hand finds her chest, and for one horrifying moment that stretches into eternity, you feel nothing. Then her tiny ribcage rises beneath your palm, so faint you might have imagined it, but real enough to restart your own breathing. She lives. She still fights. The silence was merely sleep so deep that her usual restless movements had stilled completely. But when your fingers brush her forehead, the heat that greets them sends panic racing through your exhausted mind.
The fever has climbed higher during the night, transforming her skin into something that radiates warmth like stones pulled from a fire. This is the pattern you have learned to dread, the false peace before the final battle begins in earnest. Thomas whimpers in his sleep, his young body curled around the wooden horse as if it might protect him from forces that care nothing for children's toys or mother's prayers. His breathing carries that wet rattle that has grown worse each day, and you know without looking that his lips have taken on the blue tinge that speaks of lungs struggling to draw life from air that seems too thin, too empty of what growing bodies need. Marie stirs as you rise from the straw mattress, her internal alarm system responding to changes in your movement that signal new crisis approaching. At 10 years old, she has developed the hypervigilance that marks children forced to grow up too quickly, too harshly, in circumstances that strip away innocence, like skin peeled from burned flesh. The water bucket stands empty again, its wooden bottom mocking your need for the one substance that might ease your children's suffering. But the stream lies beyond streets that have grown more dangerous each day, as desperation drives neighbors to choices they never imagined making. Hungry people do terrible things when their own children cry from empty bellies. You dress in darkness, wrapping layers of worn fabric around a body that has shrunk with worry and voluntary starvation. Every scrap of food goes to your babies first, always first, leaving you to survive on willpower and the occasional bite of bread so stale it must be soaked in water before teeth can break it apart. The door opens onto a village that resembles a battlefield more than the thriving community you once knew. Bodies lie where they fell, covered with whatever cloth their families could spare before fleeing or joining them in death. The baker's wife sits in her doorway, rocking back and forth while holding a bundle that might once have been a child, but now serves only as comfort for a mind that has retreated from reality, too painful to endure. Margaret appears beside you like a specter emerging from morning fog, her hollow eyes reflecting the same desperate determination that drives your own movements. She carries her water bucket like a weapon, prepared to defend the precious liquid against anyone desperate enough to try taking it from a mother whose remaining child grows weaker with each passing hour. The path to the stream winds between houses that tell stories of battles lost and victories so small they barely register as hope. Here, a garden where someone still tends vegetables with hands that shake from hunger. There, a doorway marked with chalk signs that warn of sickness within. Everywhere, the evidence of a world transformed by forces beyond human understanding or control. Wild dogs watch from shadows, their eyes gleaming with hunger that mirrors your own but carries different dangers. They have grown bold as human presence diminishes, and mothers carrying precious supplies make tempting targets for creatures that have learned to associate desperation with opportunity. You grip a wooden club carved by hands that once crafted toys for children, now repurposed for protection against threats, both human and animal. The stream runs clear and cold, its waters untainted by the corruption that has poisoned wells throughout the region. You and Margaret fill your buckets with liquid more valuable than gold, working quickly while scanning the surrounding forest for signs of movement that might signal danger approaching. Even this simple task requires vigilance that exhausts minds already pushed beyond normal limits. Returning through streets that grow more desolate each day, you encounter scenes that would have seemed impossible in your previous life. A woman sits beside a pile of bodies, trying to decide which child to bury first. A man wanders aimlessly, calling names of family members who no longer answer because their voices have been silenced forever. Father Benedict emerges from a house marked with the crude cross that signals another family's complete defeat. His face carries the weight of last rites administered to people who should have lived decades longer, and his hands shake with exhaustion that comes from performing too many final blessings for souls departing before their time. You nod respectfully as you pass, accepting his whispered blessing, while knowing that divine intervention has proven unreliable at best. God helps those who help themselves, and you have learned to rely primarily on your own determination, supplemented by whatever folk wisdom other mothers share during brief encounters at wells and markets. Agnes calls for you before you reach the door, her voice so weak it barely carries across the morning air. But she calls, she speaks, she recognizes your approach with awareness that signals her mind still functions despite fever that threatens to burn away everything that makes you your daughter. This recognition feels like a miracle in circumstances where miracles have become as rare as honest merchants or healthy children. Inside, Thomas attempts to sit without assistance, his small face pale but determined. He has inherited your stubborn refusal to surrender, even when surrender might bring easier rest than continued fighting. His wooden horse lies forgotten beside him as he focuses all his energy on staying upright, proving to himself and to you that he retains strength enough to keep struggling. You prepare willow bark tea with movements that have become ritual through repetition, each step performed with precision that borders on religious observance. The bitter liquid represents hope transformed into action, desperation disguised as medical treatment, love expressed through remedies that might accomplish nothing beyond demonstrating that you refuse to stop trying. Agnes resists the medicine with strength that surprises you, her small hands pushing against the wooden cup with force that suggests her spirit remains unbroken even as her body weakens. This resistance brings both frustration and joy, because fighting means living, and living means possibilities still exist for futures beyond this endless present of suffering and fear. Marie assists without being asked, her hands steady and sure as she helps position her sister for easier swallowing. She whispers encouragement in voices that carry authority beyond her years, speaking with confidence that masks terror so deep it has become part of her fundamental nature. She has learned to hide fear behind competence, just as you have learned to disguise despair as determination. The morning routine continues with careful attention to details that might mean everything or nothing, depending on forces beyond your understanding or control. Check temperatures through touch that has become calibrated to measure fever in degrees of desperation. Monitor breathing through listening that can detect subtle changes in rhythm that might signal improvement or decline. Adjust positions and blankets with precision that treats every movement as potentially significant. Other mothers begin arriving as sunlight strengthens, drawn by the same need for community that has sustained women through disasters throughout human history. They bring news from their own battles, sharing information about symptoms and treatments with the clinical detachment of soldiers comparing wounds and survival strategies. Elizabeth announces that her daughter's fever finally broke during the night, offering hope that burns bright in hearts accustomed to disappointment. But she also reports that her son has developed the telltale rash that marks the disease's progression into stages where survival becomes increasingly unlikely. Victory and defeat intertwined like threads in cloth woven from equal parts joy and sorrow. Sarah describes new symptoms appearing in her youngest child, seeking advice from women who have become unwilling experts in cataloging the progression of illness that might herald recovery or signal approaching surrender.
Her voice carries the careful control of someone who has learned that emotional displays accomplish nothing, while practical information might save lives. You listen carefully to every detail, storing knowledge that might prove crucial when your own children's conditions change or worsen. These conversations serve as both education and support group, bringing together women who understand each other's fears without need for lengthy explanations or justifications for choices that might seem incomprehensible to those who have never faced similar circumstances. The afternoon demands attention to tasks that cannot be delayed, regardless of how desperate your situation becomes. Clothes require washing despite soap shortages, and water too precious to waste on anything beyond absolute necessity. Food must be prepared from ingredients that dwindle daily, while prices climb beyond reach of purses emptied by circumstances that have eliminated normal sources of income. Fuel for the fire needs gathering, though venturing beyond village boundaries grows more dangerous as social order breaks down and desperate people make choices they never imagined considering. The forest that once provided pleasant walks now harbors threats, both human and animal, requiring vigilance that exhausts minds already pushed beyond normal limits. Marie accompanies you on these necessary expeditions, her presence both comfort and additional responsibility that complicates every decision. You must protect her while relying on her assistance. Keep her safe while teaching her skills she will need if your own strength fails before this crisis passes. The balance requires constant adjustment and careful calculation of risks versus rewards. Agnes sleeps through most of the afternoon, her small body conserving energy for battles fought at cellular levels where your love and determination cannot reach directly. You measure progress through subtle changes in skin color and breathing patterns, searching for signs that might indicate whether her internal war is being won or lost. Thomas shows improvement that lifts your heart, despite learned caution about celebrating too early. His appetite returns gradually, allowing him to consume thin gruel prepared from your diminishing stores. Each spoonful he keeps down represents victory against forces that have claimed so many other children whose mothers fought just as hard as you continue fighting. Evening approaches with familiar weight of another day survived but not conquered. Your children remain with you, still breathing, still responsive when you speak their names, still reaching for your hand when darkness makes their fears seem larger and more threatening. These simple facts constitute success in circumstances where success has been redefined by necessity and desperation. You prepare for another night of vigilant watching, knowing that fever often climbs highest during dark hours when human resistance runs lowest and death comes calling with whispered promises of peace that sounds almost tempting after weeks of exhausting struggle. But tempting or not, you refuse to listen because mothers do not rest while their children's lives hang in balance, measured by heartbeats and shallow breaths. The fire burns with reassuring warmth, fed by wood gathered through afternoon expeditions that tested courage against growing dangers lurking in forests and abandoned buildings where desperate people hide from authorities or neighbors who might report their presence to officials still attempting to maintain some semblance of order. Light dances across walls that have witnessed too much suffering and far too little joy, creating shadows that seem to hold memories of better times when laughter echoed through. Her voice carries the careful control of someone who has learned that emotional displays accomplish nothing, while practical information might save lives. You listen carefully to every detail, storing knowledge that might prove crucial when your own children's conditions change or worsen. These conversations serve as both education and support group, bringing together women who understand each other's fears without need for lengthy explanations or justifications for choices that might seem incomprehensible to those who have never faced similar circumstances. The afternoon demands attention to tasks that cannot be delayed, regardless of how desperate your situation becomes. Clothes require washing despite soap shortages, and water too precious to waste on anything beyond absolute necessity. Food must be prepared from ingredients that dwindle daily, while prices climb beyond reach of purses emptied by circumstances that have eliminated normal sources of income. Fuel for the fire needs gathering, though venturing beyond village boundaries grows more dangerous as social order breaks down and desperate people make choices they never imagined considering. The forest that once provided pleasant walks now harbors threats, both human and animal, requiring vigilance that exhausts minds already pushed beyond normal limits. Marie accompanies you on these necessary expeditions, her presence both comfort and additional responsibility that complicates every decision. You must protect her while relying on her assistance. Keep her safe while teaching her skills she will need if your own strength fails before this crisis passes. The balance requires constant adjustment and careful calculation of risks versus rewards. Agnes sleeps through most of the afternoon, her small body conserving energy for battles fought at cellular levels where your love and determination cannot reach directly. You measure progress through subtle changes in skin color and breathing patterns, searching for signs that might indicate whether her internal war is being won or lost. Thomas shows improvement that lifts your heart, despite learned caution about celebrating too early. His appetite returns gradually, allowing him to consume thin gruel prepared from your diminishing stores. Each spoonful he keeps down represents victory against forces that have claimed so many other children whose mothers fought just as hard as you continue fighting. Evening approaches with familiar weight of another day survived but not conquered. Your children remain with you, still breathing, still responsive when you speak their names, still reaching for your hand when darkness makes their fears seem larger and more threatening. These simple facts constitute success in circumstances where success has been redefined by necessity and desperation. You prepare for another night of vigilant watching, knowing that fever often climbs highest during dark hours when human resistance runs lowest and death comes calling with whispered promises of peace that sounds almost tempting after weeks of exhausting struggle. But tempting or not, you refuse to listen because mothers do not rest while their children's lives hang in balance, measured by heartbeats and shallow breaths. The fire burns with reassuring warmth, fed by wood gathered through afternoon expeditions that tested courage against growing dangers lurking in forests and abandoned buildings where desperate people hide from authorities or neighbors who might report their presence to officials still attempting to maintain some semblance of order. Light dances across walls that have witnessed too much suffering and far too little joy, creating shadows that seem to hold memories of better times when laughter echoed through rooms now filled with worried whispers and labored breathing. These memories feel both precious and painful, reminders of happiness that once seemed permanent but now appears as fragile as morning frost. Tomorrow will bring fresh challenges wrapped in familiar clothing of fear and hope, intertwined like lovers who cannot exist apart despite causing each other constant pain. New symptoms to monitor, new remedies to attempt, new reasons to continue fighting battles that seem designed to test human endurance beyond reasonable limits. But tonight you have prevailed again. Tonight, your babies sleep under protection that extends beyond physical shelter to encompass love so fierce it has transformed you into something harder and more focused than the woman who once worried about harvest yields and shoe sizes. Love has made you capable of enduring hardships that would have seemed impossible before your children's survival became the single most important mission of your existence. The night brings sounds that every medieval mother learns to interpret like scripture written in darkness. The scratch of rats in the walls means your meager stores attract vermin, but it also means the grain has not yet spoiled completely. The distant howling of wolves reminds you that predators circle closer to human settlements as easier prey disappears, but their voices also mask the approach of desperate neighbors who might covet whatever supplies you have managed to hoard. Agnes stirs restlessly beside you, her small body radiating heat that seems to pulse with each labored heartbeat. You place your ear close to her chest, listening for changes in the rhythm that has become as familiar as your own pulse. The wet sound in her lungs has deepened, taking on qualities that remind you of water sloshing in a partially filled bucket. This is not improvement. Thomas coughs in his sleep, a sound so violent it shakes his entire frame and jerks him into brief wakefulness before exhaustion drags him back into unconsciousness. When he coughs, you see specks of darkness on his lips that might be
When he coughs, you see specks of darkness on his lips that might be blood or might be shadows cast by firelight that flickers with each draft that seeps through gaps in your walls. Marie lies still as death, but her breathing remains steady and clear. She has become your anchor in storms that threaten to sweep away everything you hold precious. At 10 years old, she possesses strength that shames grown men who have fled the village rather than face the slow horror of watching their families waste away. She is your miracle, your proof that some battles can still be won. The water you gathered yesterday has already dropped to dangerous levels. 3 sick children require constant hydration. But each trip to the stream becomes more treacherous as social order continues its relentless collapse. Yesterday, you encountered 2 women fighting over a single bucket of water, clawing at each other with fingernails while their children watched from doorways with eyes that held no surprise at such desperate displays. You know you must venture out again before sunrise, but leaving your children unguarded feels like abandoning soldiers in the middle of battle. Marie is strong, but she is still a child. What if Agnes takes a turn for the worse while you are gone? What if Thomas stops breathing and needs immediate attention? What if strangers enter your home seeking shelter or supplies, or worse? These questions circle through your mind like vultures waiting for weakness to reveal itself. Every decision carries weight that could tip the balance between survival and catastrophe. Yet decisions must be made because inaction guarantees failure, while action at least offers hope of success. You rise before the first gray light touches the horizon, moving with careful silence that has become second nature during weeks of navigating between sleeping children whose rest must not be disturbed. Each footstep is placed with precision that would impress hunters tracking deer through autumn leaves. Mothers learn stealth from necessity when the alternative is waking babies who need every moment of peaceful sleep. They can steal from circumstances that offer so little comfort. The wooden bucket feels heavier each day, not because its weight has increased, but because your strength continues to diminish with each meal skipped in favor of feeding your children. Your arms shake with effort that should be manageable for someone your age, but hunger and exhaustion have transformed simple tasks into challenges that require careful planning and stubborn determination. Outside, the village presents itself like a painting created by someone who had never seen joy or hope. Abandoned carts sit where their owners left them when strength failed or death called. Gardens grow wild with weeds that choke out vegetables, their caretakers no longer able to tend crops that might feed families that no longer exist. The church bell has remained silent for days because the man who rang it lies buried in the yard beside the building where he once called people to prayer. The stream beckons from beyond streets littered with evidence of battles lost by other mothers who fought the same war you continue waging. You must cross this battlefield to reach the water that might keep your children alive for another day. Stepping carefully around obstacles that were once neighbors, whose names you knew and whose children played with your own during seasons when laughter was common as morning bird song. Margaret appears at your side without warning, her presence both comfort and reminder of futures you refuse to contemplate. She has learned to move like smoke, visible when she chooses to be seen, but otherwise blending into shadows that seem to welcome those who have nothing left to lose. Her eyes hold depths that speak of sorrows too great for words, yet she continues moving through each day with mechanical precision that keeps her remaining child alive through sheer force of will. Together, you walk toward water that represents life distilled into its purest form. Neither speaks because conversation requires energy better saved for tasks that directly impact your children's survival. But your shared silence contains communication that runs deeper than words, understanding that flows between women who recognize themselves in each other's desperate determination. The forest whispers with sounds that make your skin crawl with primitive warnings inherited from ancestors who knew that certain noises meant danger approaching on 4 legs or 2. Branches crack under weight that might belong to deer seeking water, or wolves hunting prey, or desperate humans who have chosen predation over starvation. Your grip tightens on the wooden club that has become as essential as the bucket you carry, both tools necessary for gathering what your children need to survive. The stream runs clear and cold, its waters untouched by the corruption that has made wells throughout the region dangerous to approach. You fill your bucket with liquid more precious than any treasure you possessed during your former life, when concerns about harvest yields and market prices seemed important enough to cause sleepless nights. Now, sleepless nights come from watching your children fight battles against enemies that cannot be reasoned with or bought off or frightened away. Margaret helps you lift the heavy bucket, her strength surprising for someone who appears as fragile as winter ice. But appearances deceive when desperation transforms ordinary women into creatures capable of feats that would have seemed impossible during peaceful times. Mothers discover reserves of power that exist only when their children's lives depend on finding strength beyond normal human limits. The return journey requires vigilance that exhausts minds already pushed beyond reasonable endurance. Every shadow might conceal threats. Every sound might signal danger approaching. Every moment of inattention might result in consequences too terrible to contemplate. You scan constantly for signs of movement that could indicate predators, human or otherwise, drawn by the scent of weakness that clings to desperate people like perfume made from fear. A group of children appears at the edge of your vision, moving through abandoned houses like ghosts, searching for something they will never find. These are the orphans created by circumstances that have claimed entire families, leaving behind souls too young to understand why their parents stopped breathing, but old enough to know that survival now depends entirely on their own resourcefulness. Some villages have organized care for such children, but yours has lost too many adults to spare energy for orphans when existing families struggle to keep their own members alive.
These small wanderers survive by scavenging what others have abandoned, growing wild like weeds that sprout in ruins where gardens once flourished under careful tending. You want to help them, your maternal instincts screaming at the sight of children who need protection and guidance and basic human kindness. But your own babies wait at home with fevers that could spike without warning, and the water you carry represents their best chance of seeing another sunrise. Love makes monsters of us all, forcing choices that reveal how far from civilization we can fall when pushed by circumstances that admit no compromise. Father Benedict emerges from a house marked with symbols that warn of death within, his face carrying expressions that speak of souls departing before their time and families destroyed by forces beyond human understanding. He nods as he passes, offering blessings with hands that shake from exhaustion and grief that has accumulated beyond his ability to process or release. His presence both comforts and terrifies, because priests appear at bedsides when hope has been exhausted and final preparations must be made. You accept his blessing gratefully, while praying that his services will not be needed in your home, at least not today. Not while your children still draw breath and respond when you speak their names. The familiar weight of your door handle brings relief so intense it makes your knees weak with gratitude for reaching home without incident. Inside, Agnes calls for you with voice so faint it barely disturbs the morning air. But she calls. She recognizes your return. She demonstrates awareness that proves her mind still functions despite fever that threatens to burn away everything that makes her your daughter. Thomas has managed to sit upright without assistance, his pale face showing determination that mirrors your own stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The wooden horse lies forgotten beside him as he focuses all available energy on proving that he retains strength enough to continue fighting battles that would challenge grown men twice his size. You prepare willow bark tea with movements that have acquired the precision of religious ritual through repetition and desperate hope. Each measurement matters when dealing with remedies that walk narrow lines between healing and harm, between helping and hurting small bodies already pushed beyond limits that should never be tested by children so young. Agnes resists the bitter medicine with strength that both frustrates and encourages you, because fighting means living, and living means possibilities still exist for futures beyond this endless present of suffering and fear. Her small hands push against the wooden cup with force that suggests her spirit remains unbroken, even as her body weakens under assault from enemies that cannot be seen or reasoned with. Marie assists without being asked, her competence serving as both blessing and heartbreak, because children should not possess such knowledge of sickness and remedies and the careful calculations required to keep siblings alive when parents lack proper medicines or trained healers to guide their desperate efforts. The morning routine unfolds with careful attention to details that might mean everything or nothing depending on forces beyond your control. Temperature checks through touch that has become calibrated to measure fever in degrees of desperation. Breathing assessment through listening that detects subtle changes in rhythm that could signal improvement or decline. Position adjustments and blanket arrangements with precision that treats every movement as potentially significant. Other mothers begin arriving as sunlight grows stronger, drawn together by needs that transcend normal social boundaries. They bring reports from their own battlefields, sharing information about symptoms and treatments with clinical detachment that would impress military surgeons comparing wounds and survival strategies. Elizabeth arrives with news that her daughter's condition has stabilized, offering hope that burns bright in hearts accustomed to disappointment. But she also describes new symptoms appearing in her son, seeking advice from women who have become unwilling experts in cataloging disease progression that might herald recovery or signal approaching defeat. Sarah reports that her youngest child has begun eating solid food again after days of refusing nourishment, a development that lifts spirits throughout your small gathering of desperate mothers. But her older daughter has developed complications that require careful monitoring and remedies that might not exist or might be beyond reach of empty purses and depleted supplies. These conversations serve multiple purposes, providing education and emotional support while creating networks of mutual aid that help everyone survive challenges too great for individual resistance. You listen carefully to every detail, storing knowledge that might prove crucial when your own children's conditions change in ways that demand quick responses and informed decisions. The women share more than medical information during these gatherings. They exchange techniques for stretching food supplies that grow smaller each day. They discuss which areas of the village remain relatively safe for gathering fuel or searching for edible plants. They warn each other about dangers encountered during necessary expeditions beyond the relative security of homes that offer protection from some threats while remaining vulnerable to others. Your children sleep through most of these conversations, their bodies conserving energy for battles fought at levels where love and determination cannot reach directly. You measure their progress through subtle changes in skin color, breathing patterns, and responses to stimulation, searching for signs that might indicate whether internal wars are being won or lost. Agnes shows slight improvement in her ability to swallow liquids without choking, a small victory that fills your heart with cautious optimism.
Thomas manages to consume thin gruel prepared from your dwindling stores. Each spoonful he retains, representing success against forces that have claimed countless other children whose mothers fought just as desperately as you continue fighting. The afternoon demands attention to tasks that cannot be postponed, regardless of how precarious your circumstances become.
Washing clothes despite soap shortages and water too valuable to waste on anything beyond absolute necessity. Preparing meals from ingredients that decrease daily while nutritional needs remain constant or increase as growing bodies fight diseases that drain energy faster than food can replenish it. Gathering fuel requires venturing beyond village boundaries that have become increasingly dangerous as social order continues its steady dissolution. The forest that once provided pleasant walks now harbors threats, both human and animal, creatures driven by hunger or desperation to behaviors that would have been unthinkable during peaceful times. Maria accompanies you on these essential expeditions, her presence serving as both comfort and additional responsibility that complicates every decision you make. You must protect her while relying on her assistance. Keep her safe while teaching skills she will need if your own strength fails before this crisis ends. The balance requires constant vigilance and careful assessment of risks versus benefits that change with each new development. Evening approaches with weight that has become familiar through repetition, but no less heavy for being expected. Another day survived, but not conquered. Another 24 hours during which your children remained with you, still breathing, still responsive, still reaching for your hand when darkness makes their fears seem larger and more threatening than daylight allows. These simple facts constitute victory in circumstances where victory has been redefined by necessity and desperation into measurements that would have seemed pathetically small during your former life. Now they represent achievements worth celebrating, proof that love and stubbornness can prevail against odds that favor defeat over triumph. You prepare for another night of vigilant watching, knowing that fever often climbs highest during dark hours when human resistance runs lowest and death comes calling with whispered promises of peace that sound almost tempting after weeks of exhausting struggle. But tempting or not, you refuse to listen, because mothers do not rest while their children's lives hang in balance, measured by heartbeats and shallow breaths that could stop without warning. The fire burns with warmth that pushes back against cold that seeps through walls inadequate for keeping out winter or despair. Light dances across surfaces that have witnessed too much suffering and far too little joy, creating shadows that seem to hold memories of times when laughter filled rooms, now occupied by worried whispers and labored breathing. Tomorrow will test your resolve with fresh challenges disguised as familiar problems, new symptoms to monitor and interpret, new remedies to attempt with ingredients that grow scarcer each day, new reasons to continue fighting battles that seem designed to test human endurance beyond limits that should protect mothers and children from such trials. But tonight, you have prevailed. Tonight, your children sleep under protection that extends beyond physical shelter to encompass love so fierce it has transformed you into something harder and more focused than the woman who once concerned herself with market prices and seasonal preparations. Tonight, you remain undefeated in the most important war any human being can fight, the war for the lives of those who depend entirely on your refusal to surrender. You wake on the fourth day to find Agnes burning with fever so intense that her skin feels like heated metal beneath your trembling fingers. The rash has spread across her entire torso now, angry red welts that mark her small body like some cruel map of suffering. Her breathing comes in shallow gasps that barely lift her chest, and when you call her name, her eyes flutter but fail to focus on your face.
Thomas lies beside her in a state that terrifies you more than his sister's obvious distress. He has stopped coughing entirely, his lungs too weak now to expel whatever poison has settled there. His lips carry a blue tinge that speaks of air hunger, of a body slowly forgetting how to sustain itself. When you touch his forehead, his skin feels cool and clammy, as if life itself is retreating from his extremities towards some final stronghold in his core. Only Marie remains strong, but even she shows signs of the exhaustion that has become your constant companion. Her 10-year-old face carries shadows that belong on someone decades older, and her hands shake slightly as she helps you tend to her siblings. She has become your lieutenant in this war against invisible enemies, but lieutenants can fall just as surely as the soldiers they command. The water situation has reached crisis levels. Your bucket holds perhaps enough for one more day if you ration carefully, but rationing means watching your children suffer from thirst while fever burns through their small bodies like wildfire consuming dry timber. The stream calls to you from beyond streets that have grown more dangerous with each passing hour, but leaving Agnes in her current state feels like abandoning a sinking ship. Other mothers no longer visit your home. They have their own battles to fight, their own children to mourn or save, their own impossible choices between competing loyalties and desperate needs. The informal network of mutual support that once sustained your small community has fractured under pressures too great for human bonds to withstand. Margaret stopped appearing at dawn 3 days ago. You learned from whispered conversations that her last remaining child had joined the others in the small cemetery behind the church, leaving her with nothing but grief so profound it drove her to wander the empty streets, calling names that would never again be answered by living voices. Father Benedict continues his rounds, but his visits have taken on the quality of final preparations rather than hopeful interventions.
Yesterday, he lingered at your threshold longer than usual, his eyes measuring your children with the practiced assessment of someone who has learned to recognize when earthly remedies must yield to spiritual ones. The village itself seems to be dying alongside its inhabitants. Roofs sag under the weight of repairs that will never come. Gardens grow wild with weeds that choke out vegetables no one remains healthy enough to harvest. Wells stand abandoned, not just because their water has been contaminated, but because too few people remain alive to operate the mechanisms that once brought life-giving liquid to the surface. Wild animals grow bolder each day, venturing into streets that once bustled with human activity, but now offer easy scavenging among abandoned possessions and unburied remains. You have seen wolves padding through the market square at midday, their yellow eyes reflecting an intelligence that seems to understand that this territory now belongs to creatures other than humans. The economic system that once governed daily life has collapsed entirely. Coins hold no value when there is nothing left to purchase. Merchants who survived the initial wave of sickness have fled to regions that might still offer hope of profit and safety. The blacksmith's forge has been cold so long that birds have begun nesting in its chimney. Agnes stirs restlessly as you contemplate these grim realities, her small voice calling for water in tones so weak they barely disturb the morning air. You give her what little remains in your cup, watching her throat work to swallow liquid that might as well be distilled hope for all the good it accomplishes against fevers that seem determined to burn away everything that makes her your daughter. Thomas opens his eyes when you speak his name, but his gaze holds the distant quality of someone looking at things you cannot see. He tries to smile when he recognizes your face, but the effort exhausts him so completely that he falls back into unconsciousness. That might be sleep, or might be something deeper and more permanent. The decision crystallizes in your mind with sudden clarity that cuts through weeks of uncertainty and desperate improvisation. You must reach the stream today,
regardless of risks or consequences. Without fresh water, your children will certainly die. With it, they might live long enough for their small bodies to find strength to continue fighting battles that have already claimed so many other innocents. Marie understands without explanation when you begin preparing for the dangerous journey to the water source. She nods with gravity that breaks your heart while demonstrating courage that makes you proud beyond measure. At 10 years old, she will guard her siblings with determination that equals your own, ready to fight off threats, human or animal, with weapons improvised from household implements. You kiss each of your children before departing, pressing your lips to foreheads that radiate heat or coldness, depending on which stage of sickness has claimed them. Agnes barely responds to your touch, lost in fever dreams that transport her to places where mothers cannot follow. Thomas manages to squeeze your finger with strength so faint you might have imagined it, but real enough to kindle hope that refuses to die, despite overwhelming evidence that hope is a foolish luxury you cannot afford. The streets reveal new horrors with each step toward the forest, where clean water still flows free from corruption that has poisoned everything else in your world. A child sits beside what was once her home, playing with dolls made from sticks and scraps of cloth, while her parents lie motionless in the doorway behind her. She looks up as you pass, her eyes holding the blank expression of someone too young to understand that her games have become the only reality she can safely inhabit. An elderly man staggers through the market square, calling the names of family members who disappeared weeks ago into the growing silence that has swallowed so many voices. His clothes hang loose on a frame that has shrunk with hunger and grief, and his eyes dart constantly as if expecting loved ones to emerge from shadows that hold nothing but emptiness and decay. The church door stands open, revealing rows of makeshift beds where the last surviving residents of your village wait for endings that approach with varying degrees of speed but identical certainty. Father Benedict moves among them like an angel of mercy whose powers extend only to comfort rather than healing, offering final sacraments to souls preparing for journeys beyond earthly suffering. The forest welcomes you with sounds that once seemed peaceful, but now carry undertones of menace that make your skin crawl with primitive warnings. Birds that should be singing morning songs have fallen silent, as if even creatures of the air understand that this world has become too dangerous for expressions of joy or hope. Your wooden club feels inadequate against threats that might emerge from behind any tree or bush, but it represents your only defense against predators who have learned that desperate mothers carrying precious supplies make vulnerable targets. The weight of it in your hand reminds you that survival sometimes requires violence from those who would prefer peace. The stream appears through gaps in the foliage like a vision of paradise glimpsed from hell.
Its clear waters flowing with complete indifference to human suffering that has transformed the landscape into something resembling biblical descriptions of divine punishment. You approach cautiously, scanning shadows for movement that might signal danger, approaching on feet that have learned to move with predatory silence. Filling your bucket requires kneeling beside water that reflects a face you barely recognize as your own. The woman staring back from the surface has been carved thin by hunger and marked with lines that speak of sorrows too deep for tears. Her eyes hold depths that would frighten the person she was before circumstances stripped away everything except the essential core of maternal determination. The return journey tests every survival instinct you have developed during weeks of navigating between threats, both seen and unseen. Every shadow might conceal enemies, human or animal. Every sound might herald approach of dangers that could end not just your own life, but the lives of children who depend entirely on your successful return with water that represents their only chance of surviving another day.
A group of strangers appears at the edge of your vision, moving through abandoned houses with purpose that speaks of organized scavenging rather than random wandering. These are not desperate individuals driven by hunger, but coordinated groups who have learned to profit from others' misfortune by claiming whatever valuable items remain in homes whose owners no longer need earthly possessions. You alter your route to avoid contact with these human vultures, adding precious minutes to a journey where every moment away from your children feels like betrayal. But confrontation could result in loss of water that took such risks to obtain, and returning empty-handed would guarantee outcomes you refuse to contemplate. Agnes calls for you before you reach your door, her voice so faint it barely carries across the morning air. But she calls. She recognizes your approach. She demonstrates awareness that proves some essential part of her remains present, despite fever that threatens to carry her away to places where loving mothers cannot follow or retrieve their babies. Inside you find Thomas exactly as you left him, neither better nor worse, suspended in that terrible balance between life and death, where the smallest change might tip scales towards survival or surrender. His breathing remains steady but shallow, each inhalation requiring effort that should be automatic for healthy children who have never known that drawing breath could become conscious struggle. Marie reports no significant changes during your absence, her calm professionalism masking terror that matches your own, but which she has learned to hide behind competence that would impress trained healers. She has become your partner in this desperate enterprise, sharing burdens that should never fall to children, but which circumstances have forced upon shoulders too young to carry such weight. The precious water allows you to prepare remedies that might accomplish nothing beyond demonstrating your refusal to surrender hope. Willow bark tea, bitter enough to make healthy children protest, but which sick ones accept with docility, that speaks of bodies too weak to resist ministrations that might help or might simply prolong suffering without offering genuine relief. Agnes drinks reluctantly, her small throat working to swallow liquid that tastes of desperation disguised as medicine. Each sip she retains represents victory against forces that have claimed countless other children whose mothers fought just as desperately as you continue fighting. You measure success in teaspoons consumed rather than symptoms improved. Thomas manages to take small amounts of thin gruel prepared from grain stores that dwindle daily, while prices climb beyond reach of purses emptied by circumstances that have eliminated normal sources of income. His appetite remains poor, but any nourishment represents progress in battles fought at cellular levels where love and determination cannot reach directly. The afternoon passes with careful attention to breathing patterns that have become as familiar as your own heartbeat. You listen for changes in rhythm that might signal improvement or decline, your ear pressed close to small chests that rise and fall with efforts that should be effortless for children who have never known that staying alive could require such conscious struggle. Other sounds intrude from beyond your walls, where the village continues its slow death alongside its remaining inhabitants. Distant crying that might come from children or adults, voices calling names that receive no answers, the occasional crash of structures finally succumbing to neglect and abandonment that mark the end of human habitation. Marie helps with tasks that once would have seemed impossible for someone her age, her small hands performing duties that require precision and gentleness combined with strength that comes from love rather than physical development. She has learned to read her siblings' conditions through subtle signs that might escape notice of adults who lack her intense emotional investment in their survival. Evening approaches with weight that has become familiar through repetition, but grows heavier each day as your children's conditions fluctuate between slight improvements and alarming declines that could signal approaches of endings you refuse to acknowledge as possibilities. The balance shifts constantly, requiring vigilance that exhausts minds already pushed beyond reasonable limits. Agnes shows signs of restlessness that might indicate discomfort or might herald changes in her condition that demand immediate attention and responses you may not possess knowledge or resources to provide.
Her small body moves constantly now, seeking positions that might ease suffering caused by forces that cannot be reasoned with or negotiated away through eternal devotion. Thomas sleeps more deeply than before, his unconsciousness taking on qualities that worry you, despite offering respite from struggles that have consumed his strength for days without apparent progress toward recovery. Deep sleep might signal healing, or might represent retreat from battles that have become too difficult for small bodies to sustain much longer. The fire burns low, despite your efforts to maintain warmth that pushes back against cold that seeps through inadequate walls and threatens to add hypothermia to the list of enemies your children must defeat to see another sunrise. Fuel grows scarce as fewer people remain healthy enough to gather wood from forests that have become hunting grounds for predators, both human and animal. Light dances across surfaces that have witnessed transformations no home should see. From sanctuary, where families once gathered in safety, to battlefield, where mothers wage wars against invisible enemies that show no mercy for innocence or youth. The familiar becomes strange when viewed through lens of desperation that alters perception of everything previously taken for granted. Tomorrow will test your resolve with challenges that might prove beyond human capacity to endure. But tonight, your children still breathe under protection that extends beyond physical shelter to encompass love so fierce it has transformed you into something harder and more focused than the person who once worried about seasonal preparations and market fluctuations. The sound of your own heartbeat mingles with the rhythm of small chests rising and falling in patterns that have become the most important music you will ever hear. Melodies that must continue playing if your world is to retain any meaning beyond the accumulation of losses that threaten to overwhelm what remains of hope in circumstances designed to test human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. The fifth dawn breaks with a sound that has become more familiar than your own breathing. Not the gentle stirring of children awakening to another day of play and laughter, but the harsh rattle of Agnes fighting for each breath as fluid builds in her tiny lungs. Her fever has reached heights that seem impossible for such a small body to endure. Yet somehow she continues fighting with determination that mirrors your own stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Thomas has not spoken in 2 days. His eyes open when you call his name, but they hold the glassy quality of someone looking through windows fogged by suffering that has moved beyond physical pain into territories where words cannot reach. His lips have deepened to a blue that reminds you of winter skies just before snow begins to fall, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Marie sits beside her siblings with vigilance that would shame professional guards, her young hands moving constantly to adjust blankets and check temperatures with precision learned through desperate necessity. She has not slept properly in days, yet she refuses to rest while her brother and sister hover in that liminal space between breathing and not breathing, between presence and absence. The water situation has become impossible. Your bucket sits empty except for a few drops that cling to its wooden bottom like tears shed by furniture that has witnessed too much suffering. The stream calls to you from beyond streets that have transformed into hunting grounds where desperate humans prove more dangerous than wolves. But leaving your children now feels like abandoning ship passengers who cannot swim to save themselves. You make the decision with clarity that cuts through weeks of uncertainty like a blade through silk. Marie must come with you this time. Agnes and Thomas are too weak to be moved, but they are also too weak to survive if you fail to return with water. Your 10-year-old daughter will help carry what might be the difference between life and death, sharing risks that should never be asked of children, but which circumstances have made unavoidable.
The village greets you with silence so complete it seems to press against your eardrums like physical weight. No smoke rises from chimneys. No voices call across courtyards that once bustled with daily commerce and neighborly conversation. Even the dogs have disappeared, fled or dead, or transformed into wild creatures that hunt in packs through streets where their former masters once walked in safety. Bodies lie where they fell, no longer covered by cloth, because no one remains strong enough to perform even these basic acts of human dignity. The baker's wife sits propped against her doorframe, her eyes open but seeing nothing, her hands still clutched around a wooden spoon, as if death had interrupted her in the middle of stirring soup that would never be eaten. A child wanders past without acknowledging your presence, her attention focused entirely on some internal landscape that offers refuge from realities too harsh for young minds to process. She clutches a doll made from straw and strips of cloth, whispering to it in voices so soft they might be prayers or might be conversations with imaginary friends who provide comfort that living humans can no longer offer. Marie walks beside you with steps that match your own.
Her young legs carrying her forward despite exhaustion that should have failed someone twice her age. She carries a second bucket, its weight insignificant compared to the responsibility that rests across her shoulders, like a cloak woven from desperation and love in equal measure. The forest has changed since your last visit, transformed by absence of human presence from managed woodland into something wilder and more threatening. Trees that once provided pleasant shade now loom overhead like giants frozen in attitudes of menace. Underbrush that once rustled with small creatures now whispers with sounds that make primitive warnings crawl up your spine like insects seeking warmth. Predators have learned that humans no longer pose threats worth avoiding. Fresh tracks mark the muddy path, paw prints large enough to belong to wolves that have grown bold through hunger and opportunity. You grip your wooden club with hands that know its weight and balance, prepared to defend your daughter against creatures that view desperate mothers as prey rather than fellow beings deserving of respect or mercy. The stream appears through gaps in foliage like salvation glimpsed through cathedral windows, its clear waters flowing with complete indifference to human suffering that has transformed the surrounding landscape into something resembling descriptions of purgatory found in religious texts. You approach with caution learned through weeks of survival in circumstances that punish carelessness with death. Marie kneels beside you at water's edge, her small hands steady as she helps fill buckets with liquid more precious than any treasure you possessed during your former life, when concerns about harvest yields and market prices seemed worthy of sleepless nights. Now sleepless nights come from watching children fight battles against enemies that cannot be seen or reasoned with or frightened away through maternal devotion. The return journey requires vigilance that exhausts minds already pushed beyond reasonable endurance. Every shadow might conceal threats, both human and animal. Every sound might herald approach of dangers that could end not just your lives, but the lives of children who depend entirely on your successful navigation through territories that have become hunting grounds for creatures driven by hunger or desperation to behaviors unthinkable during peaceful times. A group of figures emerges from behind ruined buildings, their movements coordinated in ways that speak of organized predation rather than random scavenging. These are not desperate individuals driven by hunger, but calculating humans who have learned to profit from others' misfortune by taking whatever valuable items remain, when owners no longer possess strength to defend their possessions. You alter course immediately, pulling Marie deeper into forest shadows that offer concealment at the cost of exposing you to different dangers. Wild animals hunt in these darker spaces, but animals kill quickly for food, while desperate humans might prolong suffering for entertainment or simple cruelty born from circumstances that have stripped away civilized behavior along with everything else that once defined human society.
The return journey requires vigilance that exhausts minds already pushed beyond reasonable endurance. Every shadow might conceal threats, both human and animal. Every sound might herald approach of dangers that could end not just your lives, but the lives of children who depend entirely on your successful navigation through territories that have become hunting grounds for creatures driven by hunger or desperation to behaviors unthinkable during peaceful times. A group of figures emerges from behind ruined buildings, their movements coordinated in ways that speak of organized predation rather than random scavenging. These are not desperate individuals driven by hunger, but calculating humans who have learned to profit from others' misfortune by taking whatever valuable items remain, when owners no longer possess strength to defend their possessions. You alter course immediately, pulling Marie deeper into forest shadows that offer concealment at the cost of exposing you to different dangers. Wild animals hunt in these darker spaces, but animals kill quickly for food, while desperate humans might prolong suffering for entertainment or simple cruelty born from circumstances that have stripped away civilized behavior along with everything else that once defined human society. The detour adds precious minutes to a journey where every moment away from Agnes and Thomas feels like betrayal of trust, so complete it should be impossible for children to place in adults who possess so little power to protect them from forces that care nothing for innocence or youth, or the absolute faith that babies place in mothers who promise safety they cannot deliver. Agnes calls for you before you reach your door, her voice carrying across morning air with volume that surprises you after days of whispers so faint they barely disturb the silence that has settled over your home, like blanket woven from sorrow and desperation. She calls. She recognizes your approach. She demonstrates awareness that proves essential parts of her remain present, despite fever that threatens to transport her beyond reach of loving hands. Inside, you find Thomas exactly as you left him, suspended in that terrible balance where the smallest change might tip scales toward survival or surrender. His breathing continues with mechanical regularity that offers neither hope nor despair. Each inhalation requiring effort that should be automatic for healthy children who have never known that staying alive could become conscious struggle, demanding constant attention. The precious water allows you to prepare remedies with precision that borders on religious observance. Willow bark tea measured with care that treats each drop as potentially significant in battles fought at cellular levels where love and determination cannot reach directly, but might influence outcomes through mechanisms beyond current understanding of how healing actually occurs in bodies pushed beyond normal limits. Agnes accepts the bitter medicine with docility that breaks your heart, while demonstrating trust so complete it should be impossible for someone her age to maintain when surrounded by evidence that adults cannot control forces that threaten everything precious. Her small throat works to swallow liquid that tastes of hope, disguised as plant matter. Each gulp she retains, representing victory against enemies invisible but undeniably real. Marie assists with competence that would impress trained healers, her movements efficient and gentle as she helps position her sister for easier consumption of remedies that might accomplish nothing beyond proving your refusal to surrender hope. She has learned to hide terror behind professionalism that masks emotions too complex for children to process while maintaining functionality necessary for survival. Thomas shows slight improvement in his ability to focus on faces when you speak his name, his eyes tracking movement with awareness that had been absent for days.
This small change sends electricity through your exhausted mind, because any deviation from decline might signal that his body has found reserves of strength sufficient to continue fighting battles that have already defeated so many other children. The afternoon passes with careful monitoring of symptoms that fluctuate between encouragement and alarm with frequency that keeps you balanced on knife's edge between hope and despair. Agnes breathes with less effort than yesterday, but her fever remains dangerously high. Thomas responds to voices with more awareness than he has shown recently, but his color continues to worry you with its resemblance to winter clouds heavy with snow. Other sounds intrude from beyond walls that offer protection from some dangers while remaining vulnerable to others. Distant weeping that might come from mothers mourning children or children mourning parents. Voices calling names that receive no answers. Occasional crashes as structures finally succumb to neglect that marks the end of human habitation. In spaces once filled with laughter and conversation, the village continues its slow death alongside remaining inhabitants who lack strength to maintain buildings or infrastructure that once supported thriving community. Roofs sag under weight of repairs that will never come. Wells stand abandoned, not just because water has been contaminated, but because too few people remain alive to operate mechanisms that once brought life-giving liquid to surface. Wild creatures grow bolder with each passing day, venturing into streets that once bustled with human activity, but now offer easy scavenging among abandoned possessions and unburied remains. You have seen foxes padding through market squares at midday, their intelligent eyes reflecting understanding that this territory now belongs to beings other than humans, who once claimed dominion over landscapes they could not ultimately control. Marie helps with evening preparations that have become ritual through repetition and desperate need for routine that imposes order on chaos, threatening to overwhelm every aspect of existence. She tends the fire with skill that belies her age, coaxing warmth from wood grown scarce as fewer people remain healthy enough to gather fuel from forests transformed into hunting grounds for predators, both human and animal. Agnes stirs restlessly as darkness approaches, her small body seeking positions that might ease discomfort caused by internal battles fought at levels where maternal love cannot reach directly. Her movements have become more purposeful than the random thrashing that characterized earlier stages of her illness, suggesting that consciousness might be returning despite fever that continues burning through her system like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Thomas attempts to speak for the first time in days, his voice so weak it barely disturbs air around his lips, but he forms words that you recognize as your name, spoken with effort that exhausts him completely. This simple vocalization represents achievement worthy of celebration in circumstances where victories are measured in heartbeats and syllables rather than grand accomplishments that once seemed important. The fire crackles with sound that has become as essential as breathing, its warmth pushing back against cold that seeps through walls inadequate for keeping out winter, or despair that threatens to freeze hope in hearts already chilled by losses that accumulate faster than healing can occur. Light dances across surfaces that have witnessed transformation from sanctuary to battlefield, where invisible wars determine which children wake to see another sunrise. Night settles over your small family with weight that grows heavier each evening as you measure progress in increments so small they might be imaginary if not for your desperate need to find meaning in changes that could signal improvement or might represent nothing more than random fluctuations in conditions that follow patterns beyond human understanding or control. You position yourself between your children and whatever dangers might emerge from darkness that has learned to hide threats, both supernatural and mundane. Your body becomes shield and weapon simultaneously, prepared to fight with strength, drawn from love so fierce it has transformed you into a creature capable of feats that would have seemed impossible during peaceful times, when physical courage was theoretical rather than practical necessity. The sound of small chests rising and falling creates a rhythm that has become more familiar than your own pulse, music that must continue playing if your world is to retain meaning beyond accumulation of sorrows that threaten to overwhelm what remains of hope in hearts designed for joy but forced to survive on determination and stubborn refusal to acknowledge defeat as possibility worth considering.
Marie sleeps fitfully beside her siblings, her young body finally succumbing to exhaustion that has been held at bay through sheer force of will and responsibility that should never fall to children, but which circumstances have made unavoidable. Even in sleep, her hands reach toward Agnes and Thomas as if her unconscious mind continues the vigilant protection that has become her primary purpose in existence.
Tomorrow will bring challenges that might test human endurance beyond breaking points that should protect mothers and children from trials designed by forces that show no mercy for innocence or youth, or absolute faith that families place in bonds stronger than death itself. New symptoms to interpret, new remedies to attempt, new reasons to continue fighting wars that seem intended to determine which souls possess sufficient courage to earn survival. But tonight, your children breathe under protection that extends beyond physical shelter to encompass love that has been refined by suffering into something harder and more focused than emotion experienced during comfortable times when threats were theoretical rather than immediate and constant. Tonight, you remain undefeated in battles that define the difference between mere existence and life, worth preserving against odds that favor surrender over stubborn hope. The sixth dawn arrives without fanfare, announced only by gradual lightening of sky visible through gaps in thatch that has begun to fail under weight of repairs, postponed too long by circumstances that demand attention for more urgent matters than roof maintenance. Agnes breathes with rhythm that seems steadier than yesterday, though fever continues burning through her small frame with intensity that makes her skin radiate heat like stones pulled from fire. Thomas opens his eyes when you call his name, focusing on your face with clarity that has been absent for days. This simple act of recognition sends hope coursing through your exhausted mind, because awareness signals that essential parts of him remain present despite illness that has claimed so many other children whose mothers fought with equal desperation but less fortunate outcomes. The water you gathered yesterday has already dropped to levels that demand another dangerous journey to the stream, but your children's improved conditions make leaving them feel less like abandonment and more like necessary risk taken for rewards that might justify exposure to dangers lurking in forests and ruined streets where desperate humans prove more threatening than wild animals. Marie volunteers to remain behind, her mature understanding of household management impressive for someone her age, but heartbreaking in its demonstration of childhood sacrificed to circumstances that force premature responsibility upon shoulders too young to carry such weight. She will tend her siblings with competence that rivals your own, guided by love that makes warriors of ordinary people when survival depends on courage drawn from depths previously unexplored. The village presents itself like archaeological site, where civilizations once thrived, but now lie buried beneath accumulation of neglect and abandonment that marks passage of time measured in catastrophes rather than seasons. Empty houses stare at you through windows that reflect nothing but emptiness. Their former inhabitants either fled or joined the growing number of bodies that mark each street like monuments to defeat. A few survivors still move through mourning routines that maintain pretense of normal life, despite evidence that normality has been permanently shattered by forces beyond human control or understanding. An elderly woman tends a small garden with movements that speak of muscle memory rather than conscious hope that vegetables might grow in soil contaminated by corruption that has poisoned everything else in this transformed landscape. Two children play games that involve no laughter, their activities focused on survival skills that should never be necessary for people their age, but which circumstances have made essential for anyone hoping to see another sunrise. They practice moving silently through rubble, hiding in shadows, identifying edible plants among weeds that grow wild in spaces once maintained by adults who possessed knowledge and tools for proper cultivation. The forest welcomes you with sounds that have become familiar through repetition, but no less ominous for being expected. Branches crack under weight that might belong to animals seeking water or humans hunting prey,
while wind carries sense of decay mixed with growing things that continue their cycles regardless of human suffering that has transformed the surrounding landscape into something resembling biblical descriptions of divine punishment. Your wooden club feels heavier with each journey, not because its weight has increased, but because your strength continues diminishing despite stubborn refusal to acknowledge physical limitations that threaten to interfere with maternal duties that must be performed regardless of personal cost. Hunger has carved away muscle and fat, leaving behind framework barely adequate for tasks that require strength you no longer possess in abundance. The stream flows with water so clear it seems to mock the corruption that has poisoned everything else in your world, its surface reflecting sky that appears normal despite hanging over landscape transformed by invisible enemies that show no mercy for innocence or youth or absolute faith that children place in adults who promise protection they cannot always deliver. You fill your bucket with movements that have become ritual through necessity, each action performed with precision that treats every drop as potentially significant in battles fought for stakes too high to contemplate losing. The liquid represents life distilled to its purest essence, hope made manifest through actions that demonstrate refusal to accept defeat as inevitable outcome of struggles that seem designed to test human endurance beyond reasonable limits. The return journey requires navigation through territories that have become hunting grounds, where predators, both human and animal, compete for resources that grow scarcer each day. You move with stealth learned through weeks of avoiding confrontations that could result in loss of supplies essential for keeping children alive long enough for their small bodies to find strength necessary for continued resistance against forces that have already claimed too many young lives. Agnes calls to you as you approach home, her voice carrying across morning air with strength that surprises you after days of whispers so faint they barely disturb silence that has settled over your household, like a blanket woven from sorrow and desperate hope in equal measure.
She calls. She recognizes your footsteps. She demonstrates awareness that proves essential elements of her personality remain intact despite fevers that threaten to burn away everything that makes her your daughter. Inside, you discover Thomas sitting upright without assistance, his pale face showing determination that mirrors your own stubborn refusal to consider surrender as acceptable option in wars that must be won regardless of cost or suffering required for victory. His wooden horse lies within reach, suggesting that interest in childhood pleasures might be returning, along with strength needed for activities beyond mere survival. The precious water allows preparation of remedies with precision that has become second nature through repetition driven by desperate necessity. Willow bark tea measured carefully, elderberry extract administered with timing, calculated to maximize benefits while minimizing risks associated with treatments that walk narrow lines between healing and harm when applied to bodies already pushed beyond normal limits of endurance. Agnes accepts medicine with less resistance than previous days, her cooperation suggesting that appetite might be returning, along with other signs that her internal battles are being won through combination of remedies, rest, and determination inherited from mothers who refuse to acknowledge defeat as possibility worth considering when children's lives hang in balance. Marie reports that both siblings showed improvement during your absence, their condition stabilizing in ways that kindle hope you barely dare acknowledge after weeks of disappointments that taught harsh lessons about celebrating too early or placing too much faith in changes that might prove temporary rather than signs of genuine recovery from illnesses that have claimed so many other children. Thomas manages to consume thin gruel without the choking that characterized previous attempts at feeding, his appetite returning gradually as strength rebuilds itself through processes that remain mysterious but undeniably real when measured against recent days when swallowing any nourishment seemed beyond his capabilities. Each spoonful retained represents victory against enemies that fight battles at cellular levels where love cannot reach directly but somehow influences outcomes.
The afternoon passes with careful attention to breathing patterns that have become as familiar as your own heartbeat. Rhythms that must be maintained if your world is to retain meaning beyond accumulation of losses that threaten to overwhelm hope in hearts designed for joy, but forced to survive on determination and absolute refusal to consider alternatives to eventual triumph over circumstances that seem designed to break human spirits. Agnes shows signs of restlessness that might indicate discomfort, but could also signal returning awareness of surroundings that had been obscured by fever-induced delirium. Her eyes track movement with focus that has been absent for days, following your activities with interest that suggest consciousness is emerging from shadows where it had hidden during worst phases of illness that threatened to carry her beyond reach of maternal love. Other mothers begin appearing at your threshold as word spreads through remaining population that your children might be recovering from conditions that have proved fatal for so many others. They come seeking advice, hope, remedies that might prove effective for their own battles against invisible enemies that show no preference for age or innocence when selecting victims from populations already weakened by hunger and despair. Elizabeth arrives with news that her son's fever has finally broken. After days of climbing temperatures that seemed certain to claim another young life, her tears of relief mirror emotions you barely allow yourself to feel. Because premature celebration has led to devastating disappointments that taught brutal lessons about the fragile nature of improvements that might be temporary rather than permanent changes in conditions that follow patterns beyond complete human understanding. Agnes breathes with less effort. Thomas responds to conversation with increasing awareness, and Marie shows resilience that makes you proud, despite circumstances that have demanded too much from someone so young.
The fire burns with warmth that pushes back against darkness, threatening to overwhelm whatever progress has been achieved through combination of remedies, determination, and perhaps influences beyond material explanations for healing that occurs when love refuses to accept defeat as inevitable outcome of battles, fought for stakes too precious to lose without exhausting every possible avenue of resistance. Agnes speaks your name clearly for the first time in days, her voice carrying across evening air with strength that brings tears to eyes that have shed too much salt over sorrows that accumulated faster than joy could balance accounts, kept in hearts designed for happiness but forced to find meaning in survival, measured by heartbeats rather than achievements that once seemed important during peaceful times. Thomas asks for food using words that form complete sentences, his request demonstrating cognitive function that had disappeared during worst phases of illness, when communication became impossible and consciousness retreated to places where mothers could not follow or provide comfort through physical presence, and whispered reassurances that promised victories not yet won. The night settles over your household with sense of possibility that has been absent for weeks. Though you maintain vigilance, that experience has taught regarding the volatile nature of conditions that can change without warning from encouraging to alarming. Your children sleep more peacefully than they have since illness arrived, to transform your home from sanctuary into battlefield, where invisible wars determine which souls possess sufficient strength to earn continued existence. You position yourself between your family and whatever dangers might emerge from darkness that has learned to hide threats, both supernatural and mundane. Your body serving as shield and weapons simultaneously, while your mind processes sounds that distinguish between normal night noise and indicators of approaches that might require defensive action drawn from reserves of courage discovered only when circumstances demand impossible feats. Tomorrow will bring fresh challenges that test your resolve, with obstacles that might prove beyond human capacity to overcome. But tonight represents progress, measured in small improvements that kindle hope you barely dare acknowledge after weeks of disappointments that taught harsh lessons about celebrating recoveries before they prove permanent, rather than temporary respite from struggles that continue, whether visible or hidden.
The sound of steady breathing from 3 children creates symphony more beautiful than any music you heard during former life, when concerts and celebrations seemed worthy of attention that now focuses entirely on rhythms that must continue playing if your world is to retain meaning beyond mere survival in circumstances designed to test whether love possesses sufficient strength to overcome forces that show no mercy for innocence or youth. The 7th morning brings something you had almost forgotten existed: silence. Not the terrible silence of stopped breathing that jolted you awake so many times before, but peaceful quiet that speaks of rest rather than struggle. Agnes sleeps without the restless turning that marked her fever's grip, her small chest rising and falling with rhythm that no longer sounds like battle drums counting down to defeat. When you place your hand on her forehead, the skin feels warm but not burning, heated by life rather than the consuming fire that threatened to steal her away. The angry red welts that had spread across her body like some cruel map of suffering have begun to fade, leaving behind patches of normal skin that seem miraculous after weeks of watching disease mark its territory on flesh. Too young to understand why such pain was necessary, Thomas sits up when he hears you stirring, his movements slow but deliberate, rather than the weak thrashing that characterized his worst days. His eyes hold clarity that had vanished so completely you wondered if you would ever see intelligence looking back at you from that beloved face. When he speaks, asking for water in a voice that sounds almost normal, you have to bite your tongue to keep from weeping with relief that might jinx this fragile improvement. Marie stretches beside her siblings, her 10-year-old body finally relaxing from the rigid vigilance that had kept her poised for crisis throughout the endless nights of watching and waiting, and praying to whatever forces might listen to mothers whose children balanced on knife edges between breathing and not breathing. She smiles when she sees Agnes sitting up without assistance, the first genuine expression of joy you have witnessed in your home for longer than memory can accurately measure. The water situation remains critical despite yesterday's successful journey to the stream. 3 recovering children require hydration that helps flush poisons from systems that have been battling invisible enemies for so long that normal function seems like luxury rather than basic biological necessity. But today, the trip feels less like desperate gamble and more like manageable risk taken for rewards that might actually be achievable. You dress in layers that have become uniform for ventures beyond the relative safety of walls that offer protection from some dangers while remaining vulnerable to others. The wooden club feels familiar in your grip, its weight balanced perfectly for defensive actions that might become necessary when encountering predators who have learned that desperate humans carrying precious supplies make attractive targets for those who have chosen hunting over gathering as survival strategy. Agnes calls goodbye when you reach the door, her voice carrying enough strength to reach across the room without strain that had marked previous attempts at communication. This simple vocalization represents achievement worthy of celebration in circumstances where progress is measured in syllables rather than sentences, in moments of awareness rather than hours of coherent conversation. The village greets you with scenes that have become depressingly familiar through repetition, but no less horrifying for being expected. Bodies lie where they fell, no longer covered because no one possesses strength or cloth sufficient for maintaining even basic human dignity. The market square stands empty except for debris that tells stories of commerce abandoned when merchants either fled or joined the growing number of casualties that mark every street. A dog wanders between abandoned stalls, its ribs visible through fur that has lost the sleek appearance that once marked it as someone's beloved companion. It watches you pass with eyes that hold weariness earned through experience with humans who have been transformed into creatures capable of actions that would have seemed unthinkable during times when food was abundant and kindness came naturally.
The church door stands open, revealing interior spaces that have been converted into makeshift hospital where Father Benedict tends to remaining parishioners who lack family members healthy enough to provide care.
His movements speak of exhaustion that goes beyond physical fatigue into territories where souls grow weary of witnessing suffering that seems to serve no purpose beyond testing human endurance against forces that show no mercy. The forest welcomes you with sounds that carry both threat and promise in equal measure. Birds that survived whatever catastrophe silenced their companions call to each other with voices that seem unnaturally loud in landscape where human noise has been reduced to whispers and footsteps carefully placed to avoid detection by predators who have learned to associate movement with opportunity. Your path winds between trees that once provided pleasant shade during afternoon walks, but now loom overhead like giants frozen in attitudes of judgment. Undergrowth rustles with movements that might belong to small creatures seeking shelter or larger ones hunting prey, while wind carries scents of growing things mixed with decay that marks the constant cycle of death and renewal that continues regardless of human suffering. The stream appears through gaps in foliage, like vision of paradise glimpsed from purgatory, its clear waters flowing with complete indifference to tragedies that have transformed surrounding landscape into something resembling biblical descriptions of divine punishment visited upon populations that somehow earn celestial displeasure through actions or omissions beyond current understanding. Filling your bucket requires kneeling beside water that reflects sky, appearing normal, despite hanging over territories marked by corruption and abandonment. Each drop that enters your container represents hope made liquid, possibility transformed into substance that might mean the difference between children who wake tomorrow and children who join the silent multitudes already claimed by forces beyond maternal power to control. The return journey demands vigilance that has become second nature through weeks of navigating between dangers both seen and unseen. Every shadow might conceal threats, human or animal. Every sound might herald approach of predators who view desperate mothers as opportunities rather than fellow beings deserving of respect or compassion that has become rare commodity in circumstances that strip away civilized behavior along with everything else that once defined human society. Agnes greets your return with smile that lights up features that had been shadowed by suffering for so long that joy seemed like emotion belonging to other people in different circumstances. She attempts to stand when she sees you approaching, her legs shaking with effort, but supporting her weight long enough to demonstrate that strength is returning to limbs that had seemed destined for permanent weakness or worse. Thomas manages to walk across the room without assistance, his steps uncertain but purposeful as he moves toward the precious water you have risked so much to obtain. His color has improved from the blue-tinged pallor that had marked him as someone dancing with death to healthier pink that speaks of blood flowing properly through veins that carry life rather than approaching defeat. The afternoon brings visitors that fill your small space with voices that carry hope rather than despair. For the first time since this crisis began its relentless assault on everything you held precious, other mothers arrive bearing news of improvements in their own children, small victories that create network of possibility, spreading through remaining population like sunrise, breaking over landscape that had been shrouded in darkness for far too long. Elizabeth reports that her daughter has begun playing with toys that had been abandoned during worst phases of illness, when consciousness retreated to places where childhood pleasures could not reach or provide distraction from battles fought at cellular levels. This return to normal childhood behavior represents healing that goes beyond mere physical recovery into territories where personalities emerge from hiding places they sought when survival required all available energy. Sarah describes her son's return to activities that had been impossible during fever's grip, his interest in wooden horses and carved soldiers demonstrating that imagination has survived orals that might have been expected to burn away everything except basic biological functions. These details matter because they indicate recovery that encompasses whole human beings rather than just breathing bodies that happen to remain technically alive. Marie participates in conversations with adults who treat her observations as valuable contributions rather than childish commentary to be politely endured. Her insights prove useful because she notices changes in her siblings that older eyes might miss or dismiss as insignificant when viewed through perspectives that have been hardened by too much exposure to disappointment disguised as temporary improvement.
The fire burns with warmth that pushes back against evening chill without requiring constant attention that had been necessary when fuel was scarce, and gathering wood meant exposing yourself to dangers that lurked in forests transformed from pleasant woodlands into hunting grounds where predators competed for resources that grew scarcer each day as human population dwindled through disease and desperation. Agnes speaks in complete sentences for the first time in weeks, her words forming thoughts that demonstrate cognitive function has returned, along with physical healing that makes her movement steady rather than the trembling that had marked previous attempts at normal childhood activities. She asks questions about things that happened while fever held her consciousness hostage, showing curiosity that indicates personality is emerging from shadows where it had hidden during worst phases of illness. Thomas laughs at something Marie says, the sound so unexpected and precious that it stops all adult conversation as everyone turns to witness this miracle of normal childhood joy expressing itself in circumstances that had seemed designed to eliminate happiness permanently from any household touched by forces that showed no mercy for innocence or youth or absolute faith that children place in adults who promise protection. The evening meal consists of thin soup prepared from ingredients that remain scarce but no longer seem impossible to obtain, as your children's improved appetites create demand that motivates dangerous expeditions to gather what can be found among abandoned gardens and wild plants that grow in spaces once maintained by people who possess knowledge and tools for proper cultivation of food crops. Night settles over your family with sense of possibility that has been absent so long you had almost forgotten what hope felt like when it was not immediately crushed by evidence that circumstances would only grow worse rather than better. Your children sleep peacefully for the first time since this ordeal began, their breathing steady and unlabored as their bodies finally begin the slow process of rebuilding strength that had been consumed in battles against invisible enemies. You maintain vigilance that experience has taught regarding the volatile nature of recovery that can reverse without warning, but tonight feels different from all the nights that came before it.
Tonight carries weight of genuine progress rather than temporary respite from struggles that continue, whether visible or hidden beneath surfaces that might appear calm while concealing storms that could emerge without warning to destroy whatever improvements had been achieved through love and determination. The sound of 3 children breathing in rhythm that speaks of rest rather than struggle creates music more beautiful than any symphony you heard during former life, when concerts seemed worthy of attention, that now focuses entirely on melodies that must continue playing if your world is to retain meaning beyond mere survival, in circumstances that test whether human bonds possess sufficient strength to overcome forces designed to separate families through methods too cruel for civilized minds to fully comprehend. Tomorrow will bring fresh challenges that require continued vigilance and careful attention to details that might signal changes requiring immediate response. But tonight represents victory measured in heartbeats that no longer race with panic, and breathing that flows naturally rather than fighting against obstruction that had threatened to stop the essential processes that sustain life in bodies too small to understand why such battles were necessary for continued existence in world transformed by invisible enemies. Marie sleeps between her siblings, her young body finally relaxing completely for the first time since assuming responsibilities that should never fall to children, but which circumstances made unavoidable when survival required every family member to contribute whatever strength they possessed to collective effort aimed at keeping everyone alive long enough for healing to occur through mechanisms that remain mysterious but undeniably real when measured against recent improvements. The fire burns low but steady, its glow creating shadows that dance across walls that have witnessed transformation from sanctuary where families once gathered in safety to battlefield where mothers wage wars against forces beyond understanding.
and now perhaps back towards something resembling normal domestic space, where children might grow up surrounded by love rather than constant fear of losing everything precious without warning or explanation. Your own breathing synchronizes with the rhythm of small chests that rise and fall with efforts that appear effortless for the first time in weeks, creating harmony that speaks of family bonds strong enough to survive testing. That would have destroyed lesser connections between people who shared nothing more than proximity, rather than love refined by suffering into something harder and more enduring than emotions experienced during comfortable times when threats were theoretical rather than immediate and constant. The 8th day dawns with Agnes standing at the window, her small hands pressed against wood that frames opening where light enters to illuminate features that have regained color and expression that had been absent during fever's occupation of consciousness that belongs to childhood rather than battlefields, where invisible wars determine which souls possess sufficient courage to earn continued participation in a world that often seems designed to reward suffering rather than joy. Thomas moves across the room with steps that no longer require conscious effort, his 7-year-old body remembering how to be a child rather than a patient clinging to life through sheer determination. He reaches for the wooden horse his father carved, fingers tracing details that had been forgotten during weeks when survival consumed every moment of attention that might otherwise have been devoted to play and wonder and the simple pleasures that define childhood in peaceful times. The transformation in your home feels so complete that you almost fear acknowledging it, as if speaking aloud about improvement might somehow jinx the delicate progress that has emerged from weeks of desperate struggle against forces that seem determined to claim everything precious. Yet you cannot deny the evidence before your eyes when Agnes asks for porridge instead of merely accepting whatever thin gruel you could coax past lips that had forgotten how to swallow. Marie busies herself with morning tasks that no longer carry the weight of life or death urgency, her movements relaxed in ways that remind you she is still a child, despite the premature responsibilities that circumstances forced upon shoulders too young to bear such burdens without permanent changes to personality and worldview that should have remained innocent for years longer. The water bucket requires refilling, but today this necessity feels manageable rather than impossible. Your children's steady breathing and improved color give you confidence to venture beyond walls that have served as fortress against dangers both visible and imagined. The village streets that once resembled battlefields now appear merely damaged rather than actively hostile to human survival. Other mothers emerge from homes that had seemed destined to become tombs, their faces showing cautious optimism that mirrors your own careful hope. Elizabeth waves from her doorway, where her daughter plays with cornhusk dolls, the child's laughter carrying across morning air like music that had been silent so long its return seems miraculous rather than normal expression of childhood joy returning to spaces where it belongs. Sarah's son chases a wooden hoop through puddles that reflect sky instead of despair, his energy demonstrating recovery that encompasses whole human beings rather than just breathing bodies that happen to remain technically alive. These sights fill your heart with emotions you had almost forgotten existed, feelings that extend beyond mere relief into territories where genuine happiness might once again become possible. The stream flows with waters that seem clearer than before, though perhaps this perception reflects changes in your own outlook rather than actual improvements in liquid that has remained constant while everything around it transformed through cycles of destruction and potential renewal. You fill your bucket with movements that have become ritual, but ritual performed with gratitude rather than desperate necessity. The forest whispers with sounds that no longer carry undertones of menace.
Branches rustling in wind that speaks of growing things rather than decay that had marked so much of recent experience. Birds call to each other with voices that seem to celebrate survival rather than mourn losses that accumulated faster than healing could occur during worst phases of crisis that tested human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Agnes greets your return by running toward you on legs that support her weight without trembling, her arms outstretched in gesture of welcome that brings tears to eyes that have shed too much salt over sorrows, but now might learn to weep from joy rather than grief that had become constant companion during weeks when hope seemed luxury you could not afford. Thomas follows his sister's example, moving with coordination that demonstrates his small body has remembered how to function as integrated system, rather than collection of failing parts struggling independently against forces that threaten to overwhelm defenses weakened by sustained assault from invisible enemies that showed no mercy for innocence or youth. The afternoon brings visitors who carry news of recoveries, spreading throughout remaining population like sunrise, breaking over landscape that had been shrouded in darkness for far too long. Father Benedict appears at your threshold, his face showing expressions that speak of prayers answered rather than last rites administered to souls departing before their appointed times arrived through natural processes, rather than intervention by forces beyond human understanding. Margaret returns from wandering that had consumed days following losses too great for rational minds to process without retreating into territories where grief could be managed through movement rather than stillness that force confrontation with realities too painful for immediate acceptance. Her presence signals that community bonds might survive testing that seemed designed to destroy every connection between people who once shared more than proximity and mutual need. The fire burns with warmth that fills your home with light that illuminates faces, showing expressions of contentment rather than the anxious vigilance that had marked every waking moment during weeks when breathing could not be taken for granted and consciousness might disappear without warning into places where loving mothers could not follow or provide comfort through physical presence. Agnes speaks about tomorrow as if future existence could be assumed rather than hoped for against overwhelming evidence that circumstances might change without warning to destroy whatever progress had been achieved through determination and love and stubborn refusal to accept defeat as inevitable outcome of struggles that seemed designed to separate families through methods too cruel for civilized minds to comprehend. Thomas asks questions about activities that extend beyond immediate survival, his curiosity indicating that mental energy once devoted entirely to fighting battles at cellular levels has been freed for exploration of a world that might once again offer possibilities for growth and learning, rather than merely continued existence measured in heartbeats that must be counted because they could stop without sufficient warning for preparation or acceptance. Marie begins planning lessons for her siblings, her maternal instincts channeling themselves into educational activities that demonstrate healing that encompasses psychological restoration rather than just physical recovery from illnesses that had threatened to claim not just lives, but personalities that define individuals as unique human beings worthy of love and protection and hope for futures that extend beyond mere survival. The evening meal consists of food that tastes of nourishment rather than desperation, ingredients gathered from sources that no longer require risking life for sustenance, that barely qualified as adequate for maintaining basic biological functions. Your children eat with appetite that speaks of bodies rebuilding themselves rather than consuming whatever fuel could be obtained for engines running on determination alone. Night settles over your household with a weight that feels protective rather than threatening.
darkness that promises rest rather than vigilance against dangers that might emerge when vision failed, and hearing became primary defense against predators who had learned to hunt when human senses were most vulnerable to surprise attacks from creatures driven by hunger or opportunity. You lie beside children who breathe with rhythm that speaks of peaceful sleep rather than struggles that had characterized every night during weeks when consciousness might retreat into places where recovery occurred through processes beyond maternal power to influence directly, but somehow responsive to love that refused to accept alternatives to eventual triumph over circumstances that tested whether human bonds possess sufficient strength to survive testing that would have destroyed lesser connections. The sound of steady breathing creates a symphony that celebrates victory, measured not in grand achievements, but in simple continuation of life processes that have been threatened by forces beyond understanding, yet somehow defeated through combination of remedies and determination, and perhaps influences that operate beyond material explanations for healing that occurs when love encounters obstacles that seem insurmountable but prove vulnerable to persistence that draw strength from sources deeper than conscious knowledge. Agnes murmurs in her sleep, words that form dreams about playing in gardens that exist beyond walls that have served as fortress against world transformed by invisible enemies. Her voice carries contentment that had been absent so long.